Welcome to the Triangle Institute for Security Studies roundtable discussion entitled Everything Looks Like a War, State Security Forces and Citizen Security. This webinar is being recorded. I'm Tricia Sullivan, Associate Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies. TIS is a consortium of Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, and NC State University. Since its founding in 1958, TIS has worked to encourage rigorous and objective scholarship in national and international security, to facilitate conversation between civilians and the military, and to educate the leaders of the future. Tonight, our overarching goal is to put the police brutality, domestic use of the military and other irregular state security forces, and repression of dissent we have all been witnessing in the last few months in broader context. Democracies have institutions to guard against repression, constitutional limits on government powers, independent judiciaries, press freedom, civil society, and free and fair elections to hold political leaders accountable. Nevertheless, the extent to which state security forces are principled protectors of the citizenry varies across time and space, even within democracies. Tonight, we have an outstanding panel of scholars to help us put current events in historical and cross-national perspective. During the panel discussion, we encourage all the attendees to submit your questions using the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen. After about 45 minutes, we will bring in Professor Kyle Beardsley, who will pose your questions to our panelists. It would be helpful if you could tell us who you are and, if relevant, and if you care to, what university or organization you are affiliated with when you submit a question. So I want to have plenty of time to hear from our panelists and take your questions, so I'll only do the briefest of introductions for our panelists. In alphabetical order, we have Risa Brooks, Alice Chalmers Associate Professor at Marquette University, non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and adjunct scholar at West Point's Modern War Institute. She is the author of Shaping Strategy, the Civil Military Politics of Strategic Assessment, and co-editor of Reconsidering American Civil Military Relations. Christian Davenport is Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, President of the Peace Science Society International, and Research Professor at the Peace Research Institute Oslo. Since 1992, his research has explored what influences state repression and what can be done to reduce its occurrence. He is the author of 6 books, including How Social Movements Die and State Repression and the Domestic Democratic Peace. Erica de Bruin is Assistant Professor of Government and Director of the Justice and Security Program at Hamilton College. She is currently a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And her first book, How to Prevent Coups, will be published with Cornell University Press this year. Abigail Hall is an Associate Professor in Economics at Bellarmine University. Her research explores domestic police militarization, weapons as foreign aid, and the cost of military mobilization. She is currently researching the relationship between militarism and domestic extremism. She is the author with Christopher Coyne of Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism. And Javier Osorio, an assistant professor in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on understanding the micro-foundations and dynamics of political and criminal violence in Latin America. He is the founder of the Academy for Security Analysis, a project to build regional institutional capacity on citizen security policies supported by the United States Agency for International Development, El Salvador. To begin, each of the speakers will take about 5 minutes to give you a brief introduction to their perspective on our topic. And I'm going to ask Javier Osorio to start us off.
Thank you very much, Tricia, for the invitation. Welcome, everybody. Let me start by addressing some of the questions that are motivating this roundtable. I definitely think that we're witnessing an increasing coerciveness of security forces in the US. And based on the experience and the cooperative experience in Latin America, I think we can send some cautionary notes about the problems of this increasing militarization or coerciveness undermining civil society and citizen security. We also are likely to see an increase of human rights violations by security forces and also the erosion of democratic governance in the US. One of the key elements or constraints of the use of coercive power that we have in the US is the Posse Comitatus Act, which is this federal law that prevents the army from engaging in policing activities or to enforce domestic laws. However, despite this federal law enforcement agencies finding ways to go around those limitations to increase the militarization of police forces by adopting tactics or by transferring military-grade supplies. Basically, instead of increasing the profile of security and citizen protection, they're increasing the profile as violence specialists. We see the proliferation of SWAT teams. We also see this 1033 program of transferring military equipment and weapons to law enforcement agencies, the erosion of the castle doctrine, and more recently, the use of National Guard and other law enforcement agencies to control the population and try to help with law enforcement and policing tactics. So all of these elements give us some cautionary notes from Latin America, where we have a very broad range in terms of variations of the extent of the involvement of the military in law enforcement activities and policing from a variety of perspectives. In Latin America, we have countries that come out from military dictatorships, others come from civil wars, and given their historical backgrounds, we have a wide variety of very highly centralized military police, as we have in Colombia, Brazil, and Chile. And other cases, we have more hybrid regimes with a mix of police, civil police and military police, and some other states or countries that have a lot more civil profile police in a lot repressive manner. But throughout Latin America, we've been seeing an increasing militarization of security, citizen security, with the excuse of the war on drugs, fighting organized crime and criminal organizations, but that is also affecting civil society and the broader population in many different aspects. One of the key consequences that we see from Latin America is that of providing more aggressive policing and policing tactics is actually undermining and being counterproductive in terms of provision of citizen security. We see an increasing tension between law enforcement agencies, either very civilian or quasi-military, against the population. We see many instances of state repression against activists and people who are vocal against the state, particularly about citizens who mobilize to demand rights or to push governments through civil disobedience. We see a lot of repression from very repressive government agencies against the population. So that is really undermining the conditions of security and citizen security in Latin America. An extension of that is the use of very coercive law enforcement policies in the war on drugs that actually create a lot more violent dynamics within or among criminal organizations who are heavily armed and they don't have any respect to human rights or the broader population. So that is actually being counterproductive. Also, by increasing the role of the military, we see a lot more exposure of military tactics to the population that increases human rights violations. And many of these these incidents, they do not yield to accountability, because many of these military police, they obey a completely different kind of law, which is a military law. They're not subject to civilian law. And overall, the increasing repressiveness of law enforcement agencies and the militarization of police is actually undermining civilian governance and democratic governance, because staying in power for many of these governments actually rely a lot on heavy policing and the militarization of police to stay in power. So they stay in power because of them and not because of popular support. So in order to stay in power, they need to give concessions and more provisions and favors to militarized police. So in that way, the increasing militarization of law enforcement in the US from a comparative perspective can send some signals of probably deterioration of public security, increasing human rights violations, and the erosion of democratic governance in the US.
Thank you, Javier.
Yeah.
Let's pass this along. If we could have Abigail Hall talk next.
Hi, everyone. So thank you to Trisha and to TIS for having me. I'd echo a bit of what Javier said, in that if we want to look at the data about police militarization, I think you can make a very convincing argument, particularly within the borders of the United States, that police have become progressively more militarized. So you can look at things like not only weapons flows, but you can also look at things like the creation and implementation of SWAT teams within a variety of different jurisdictions, both large and small, as well as looking at things like the number of SWAT deployments. One of the things that I think is particularly important, particularly when we're talking about the context of police militarization in democratic societies, is to recognize that democratic institutions have long recognized this paradox of government, that any government strong enough to protect its citizens can likewise use that same power to predate against them. One of the constraints that has been put in place in a variety of democracies in an attempt to address this paradox of power is the separation of police and the military. One of the things that I think is an overlooked contribution to police militarization is actually foreign intervention. So oftentimes when we think about foreign and domestic policies, they're often presented as being completely divorced. So foreign policy is just that, what's occurring outside of geographic borders, whereas domestic policy are those that are occurring within a particular country. But what people seem to not recognize is that foreign intervention, when democracies are engaged in such endeavors, those constraints that might be binding the government domestically are either weak or in some cases altogether absent within the context of a foreign intervention. And this effectively provides a testing ground for governments to engage in the exploration and the refinement of both new and existing tools of social control. And government agents, through a variety of different channels, can then import those tools back to the country that is doing the intervention. And so ultimately what we can see as a result of these foreign interventions is an effective erosion of these constraints that are supposed to be protecting the citizens of democratic countries, ultimately undermining some of the critical functions of a democracy. And one place where we can see this very clearly is actually in the militarization of police. So we see this in places like the advent and the continued use of SWAT teams, as Javier mentioned, looking at weapons flows, what tools police are using. We also see this in things like different surveillance tactics and techniques. We can also see this in other places as well, including US prisons and jails. And so for all of these different reasons, of course, related to some of the motivating questions for the panel today, there is a very real impact across the citizenry in countries like the United States, but we also see that these disproportionately impact communities of color.
Thanks so much, Abigail. Erica, could you come on next?
Sure, thank you so much. So thanks so much for organizing this panel today. I think I'll just try to add on to a little bit of what our panelists have said so far about militarized policing and what we know about its impacts on citizen security. So one thing I just want to start out by pointing out is that the recent protests in the United States have raised concerns about two different forms of militarized policing. So first, this is how the first form is happening at the local level. And this is where local police forces at the city or the county level around the country have increasingly gained access to military grade weaponry and equipment. As our previous panelists have noted, this is not entirely a new process. SWAT teams have been established in local forces as early as the 1960s in the United States. And the Crime Control and Safe Streets Act in 1968 was the first to start providing military-grade weaponry and equipment to local police forces. And so this is a sort of process that's been happening for a long time in the United States, but it has really accelerated in recent years under Defense Department programs to channel additional goods from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there really is this sort of connection between what's happening externally, the use of military force abroad, and what's happening in local policing in the United States. So that's the first form of militarized policing that's happening in the US. The second is happening at the federal level. So if you're paying attention to coverage of protests in Washington, D.C. or in Portland, Oregon, you may have noticed that President Trump called on a range of federal forces there, including ICE, Customs and Border Patrol, the Transportation Security Administration, the Federal Protective Service, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies to be policing those protests. All of these federal police forces have more specialized functions related to border control or immigration, but they're being repurposed for internal policing much more generally. And they have this sort of military character. They have access to military-grade weaponry. They're organized into military-style formations. They can deploy over long distances. And so that type of military policing is, I think, distinct from what's happening at the local level. So one thing I can try to do is try to put those two developments related to militarized policing in the United States in a broader sort of comparative context. One thing that I've done the past couple of years is collect data on state security forces and police forces in a sort of global sample. And what this data suggests is that the United States is not by any means unique in relying on militarized policing. The data that I've collected suggested that some 75% of countries, at least as of 2010, use some sort of militarized policing at the federal level, and 60% of democracies. So even among democratic regimes, it's not necessarily odd that the United States has these type of militarized police forces. But what is unique about militarized policing in the United States is how fragmented and decentralized the system of policing is. So no other democracies that I looked at, I think with the exception of India, have this many distinct police forces at the federal level, and none have this kind of overlapping system of local, state, and federal police forces all being militarized to some degree. So that is really unique. And most other democracies just have fewer police and internal security forces overall. Furthermore, while SWAT teams and riot police and tactical units have become more common, particularly in the last 2 decades internationally, it's very rare for states to create new sort of federal paramilitary style police forces like the creation of ICE in 2003 in the United States. So in that, the United States is really out of step with trends that are happening in other democracies. As our previous panelists have noted, there's all sorts of negative associations or consequences that can come from militarized policing for citizen security. And in particular, we now have a number of studies of militarized policing in the United States that suggest that they're focused on militarized policing at the local level, that show that the more military goods that a local police force receives, the higher number of civilians are killed in subsequent years, and the higher number of officers that are involved in participating in officer-involved shootings. And so it seems that this is pretty unambiguous, this evidence at this point. And there's also some evidence, Javier was mentioning from Latin America, suggesting that where police forces are militarizing, there's more human rights violations. What's driving this is we don't have a great sense of. I think that the basic idea is that, as the sort of title of this panel suggests, everything looks like a war. When you have access to military-grade weaponry, you might end up using those weapons in ways that just because they're available, right? So the culture of sort of militarization can seep into law enforcement agencies, and they can become ever more likely to rely on violence to try and solve whatever problems they're having in interacting with the community and trying to address crime. However, I think despite what we know about the sort of negative of militarized policing for civilian citizen security. I think we don't have a good sense yet of what the sort of longer term effects might be. And by that I mean, I think as the responses to the protests, the sort of militarized policing response to protests has illustrated in the U.S., responding to protests with excessive force, as is more likely where you have militarized police, can inflame political opposition rather than suppress it, right? So you can have situations in which having a more militarized response ends up actually creating a sort of mobilizing process in rather than suppressing opposition, it actually ends up inflaming it. So my intuition here is that it's not only harmful to citizen security, but it's probably not actually useful for containing political opposition either. And so it's detrimental for a whole number of reasons. So I'll stop there and pass it on to our next panelist.
Thanks so much, Erica. Christian?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and having the event. We live in a very interesting period to the extent to which we're now raising some questions that I think are well overdue. For example, security force institutions, we fundamentally need to address the issue of whose security are we discussing, civilians or capital? And secure from what? Secure from exploitation and violence with regards to civilians, or from rebellion and challenge in the context of capital and corporations. Like what's in a label, this becomes extremely important for us because even using the phrase security force lends the state a certain degree of legitimacy that I don't think it necessarily deserves by definition. So Nicole Siegel tries to push that and talk about violence workers. The state is in part defined by its connection with violence. So violence workers seems to be a heck of a lot more appropriate and a better starting place in many respects. As it relates to some of the questions that we're addressing on this particular panel, the democratic piece, or the domestic democratic piece, the fact that democracies generally tend to diminish repression is only part of the findings that we get in the literature. The other part of the finding that we always seem to forget about is democracy decreases repression unless there is a behavioral challenge. If there's a behavioral threat, behavioral challenge, then that effect goes away. And so what's needed then for the literature to do is then figure out why is there this weakness in the democratic piece? Why are democracies likely to repress as much as any other actor? And so we approach this time period now in a moment where we get to rethink the relationship between these violence workers and civilians. And we start to reflect on exactly what we would like to see. I was very much taken by Jim Scott's characterization because many of our conversations begin was like, oh, how can we do without these actors? They have to be there. We need to protect ourselves from other people. But Scott identifies very clearly, you know, humans have been on the planet for about 100,000 years, 14,000 years have involved the state, and 3,000 of that have involved a capable state. So clearly we've been able to exist on the planet without them. And what I like about this current moment is we're now beginning to wonder what these institutions, these force-wielding institutions, what they should be, what they could be, and what they can or should do. And these are, I think, important issues that are finally being raised to a particular level. I'm here in part to kind of make sure that that part of the conversation is continued because I think, unfortunately, we don't have enough conversations about the role of force and violence in our lives and exactly what we would like. But I mean, Hobbes's conception, even of itself, was conditional. We should defer to these particular actors as long as they are protecting us. And to the minute they start predating, the minute they start moving in the opposite direction, then they are no longer worthy of our support. And in that context, we should get rid of them.
Thanks so much, Christian. Risa?
Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. And thank you to my fellow panelists for raising some really important issues and reflecting on sort of security in a broader sense and what that means for the country's civilians, the world's civilians, and lots of important issues there. I'm going to take a different direction and focus on a pretty specific question in context of the current moment and the imminent election and the possibility that the US is going to experience some really large-scale political violence, and focus on one actor in the security sector, the regular military. And I just want to quickly distinguish the regular military from other actors in the security sector, just to make sure that we're clear, because they have different motivations and are different animals in some sense, as my fellow panelists have underscored. So on one level, we have state and local forces, the police, what many Americans might think of. You have federal forces, like those attached to the Department of Homeland Security that Erica mentioned, several of these that have been active in Portland. You also have National Guard, which is a state militia, usually under the control of state governors, and then sometimes it is what's called federalized, so becomes under control of the federal government. And last, you have the regular military. Now, this is what many people will think of as the military that operates overseas and is involved in wars and for external purposes. And I want to talk about that particular actor and what role they might play in any political violence in the event that they are ordered to actually go into the streets and participate in policing people. One thing just to note is it's pretty rare for the regular military, the military, overseas military, to be involved in domestic, in the contemporary period, in domestic sort of operations, so to speak. The last time was during Rodney King, 3 decades ago in 1992, when after Rodney King was beaten, the police officers were acquitted of that crime. And it became a very intense time with like many dozens of people dead, many thousands injured, lots of fires. It was a really disruptive moment. And that was the last time, with the invitation of the governor to go and participate in this, that actually occurred. So it's been 3 decades since the regular military has been involved. But we've heard recently in June, maybe some of you have been paying attention, that there was a discussion of having the military being brought out to police protesters to participate in that effort, including potentially invoking something called the Insurrection Act, which is a very old piece of legislation that basically allows the military to counter rebellions and insurgencies. So it was very odd, sort of poor context for even thinking about something like that. That effort was pushed back. That did not happen. The regular military did not go into the streets at that time, but I think it's possible that that could happen. Donald Trump has talked about it again. His allies are talking about it again. And I think it's not something that's beyond the pale that he might do that, order them in. So what would happen? And that's what I'll sort of talk about for the next 2 to 3 minutes, and then finish up and we'll go to questions. I think you would see some initial reluctance on the part of the military leadership to do that. They don't view themselves as a domestic security force. They view themselves as quite different than the other federal law enforcement folks that you see in Portland, for example. And we saw a fair bit of pushback in June, and that's probably why Donald Trump actually backed off, in part, one of the reasons to that. The military in the US has remarkable popularity, and that sort of activity would definitely potentially really harm its reputation. I think that's a consideration. And just globally, comparatively, institutionalized militaries like the US's don't like to be participating in internal security operations, like was what was being proposed. I think that if they're ordered to do it, though, they will. They will go to the streets because unless it's an illegal order, they will do it. And in that case, what will happen, I think, will depend a lot on what they're ordered to do, what the soldiers, the troops might be ordered to do. Would they be participating and sort of logistically helping, or actually on the streets facing off in front of people? And how that would go, I think, depends a lot on sort of in addition to sort of what they're asked to do, you know, what's the level of discipline you're seeing to follow whatever orders they might be given. But I think sort of one big piece of it, and I'll sort of close with this as a consideration, is what we know from comparative research around the world is that when militaries go into the streets, their social identities are really tested. And some of them may identify with some of the protesters. We saw this in June with some of the George Floyd protesters, some of the African-American soldiers, National Guard in that case, sort of identifying. You could also see some much darker dynamic with some of in the military, some of the sort of racist, you know, there's some signs that there could be elements of white supremacy within some of the ranks there, and that they might identify with some of the other sort of self-described militia groups and civilian actors that are in the mix, and that could be a really dangerous cocktail. We really don't know much about that sort of problem within the military today. We do know that those groups, those civilian militia groups, far right, anti-government groups, white supremacist groups, those groups would like and have been trying to infiltrate the military. It's certainly an effort that they've been making. So I wonder and worry that there would be sort of potential tests on the loyalty of the troops, and that could really feed into a pretty ugly dynamic and you know, really scary time for a lot of people.
Thanks so much, Risa. So I want to bring back, if the rest of the panelists want to unmute themselves and turn on their videos, I'd like to have continue this discussion for a little bit. And there's so much interesting that all of you had to say. I'm having a hard time figuring out where to start my questioning. But I was wondering, a couple of you at least mentioned this idea that the militarization of policing is counterproductive. Not only are there more likely to be human rights abuses and possibly deaths from police violence, but it actually seems counterproductive in terms of maintaining public safety. So I'm wondering what you think might be the incentives for political leaders or for local or state police. If this is counterproductive, why go in that direction? Christian?
Two things. One, when we say militarization of the police, there's two different ways to view it. One is kind of technological, so like hardware, and the other one is kind of like personnel. And from the personnel side, it's kind of silly to talk about the militarization of the police when it's like it's such a natural progression from you go from on tour and then you work for a police department, or you work for a police department and you go to work for some private security thing. So we're setting up kind of a false dichotomy there. But with regards to the second question about effectiveness, the presumption that governments are understanding of effectiveness and apply the right methodology is just our pathology for kind of like reifying right rational choice. Let's get straight with it. If we take the literature, we know that enhancing punishment has no effect on the crime. This literature has been very clear for quite some time. So why do people continue to put people in jail and then to kind of add the death penalty and all these other things? Well, David Garland and other in his work kind of suggests it's something about the security force institution itself that leads to a certain degree of momentum, nothing to do with effectiveness. And in fact, just because it leads to more dissident behavior, further justifies your activity. When the FBI had basically produced a reduction of communists in the 50s and 60s, they're before Congress asking for more money because they were just like, well, what the decrease tells us is that the communists have become better at hiding. So they just had an understanding that they wanted more, they wanted access to more, they wanted to get more credibility, more resources, and so forth. And so I'm not sure that rationality is the way that we should kind of approach this idea of social control.
Javier?
I think we can trace the origin or the motivation of increasing the coercive apparatus of the state by this tension of liberty and security. The root of many, or at least the institutional birth of many of the institutions that we see now turning against citizens comes with the Patriot Act. The terrorist attacks where the government called for support and passed legislations to create ICE, to strengthen border patrol, to increase the budget of the military, in order to provide security to people. And in order to do that, people concede a greater presence of coercive apparatus, monitoring of the population, increase the security apparatus at the expenses of civil rights and civil liberties. Now that we have a stronger apparatus, when the state is facing existential threats from the population itself, now they find themselves having all these fantastic organizations with resources, capacity, tactical and operational functionality that now they can use to suppress and repress those existential threats. But I think the origin of the political motivation at the beginning was, let's provide security to the people, maybe at the expenses of liberty. Now that the liberty is more constrained, we can use those military policing resources to turn them against when we need them, right? And this idea of to serve and to protect that Christian mentioned in his intervention, to serve and to protect whom, right? We know that African Americans and Hispanics and other minorities, they don't are very well served or protected, quite probably the opposite. The regular interactions with law enforcement agencies is harassment, incarceration, very hostile interactions, while there are other sectors that are being protected.
Abby?
Sure. So just to add on to what the prior two panelists have said, I think the motivation for this expanded militarization of police is multifaceted, but there are a couple of different things specifically that we could point to. So one is that in some instances, take example, police departments, there are certain policies and procedures that were adapted by the military that veterans in particular saw as being transferable to policing. SWAT teams are a prime example, being based explicitly off of elite force reconnaissance units that were being deployed in Vietnam and then subsequently brought into Los Angeles. And then over a period of several decades, they're practically universal across the country. I think the other big point to make is a standard economic point about where do your budgets come from. So we start to see that police departments are being tied in with these ongoing quote unquote wars on both drugs and then now terrorism. So you now have these, what were, or at least intended to be, local peacekeepers who are now deeply entrenched in these larger federal policies whose budgets are then subsequently tied to engaging in these conflicts. So you bring in then those other pieces, I believe that Christian mentioned about this pipeline between military and police. And I don't think it's particularly surprising that we see this continued incentive to expand.
Ooh, thanks. I'll ask in a minute if anybody sees any hope for us, but Eric, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, thanks. The only things I'd add is to the great points that have been made was that that have been made so far is that there's often there's demand at the local level among local police departments for this type of equipment because it's perceived as prestigious. You get specialized training, you look different from the other sort of local police. And so even for those that don't have a military background personally, there can be a sort of appeal of being a part of this sort of elite unit. They're really perceived in that way. And they're free, where the military equipment that's coming to local police departments is just bonus additional equipment that is not, the local police department doesn't have to take out of its local budget. And so it was, I think, seen, at least under the most recent DoD program, as a sort of, a expedient way for the Defense Department to get rid of this equipment it didn't need. And for local police, we're delighted to have this in many cases, right? They're not going to turn this down. So there is some sense of this being something that they they're not the ones typically trying to step back and have a sense of whether or not this is actually effective or having a negative effect on the people that are being policed, but that this is some sort of additional bonus. And then outside the US context, you also see, I think, that there's often a difference in public perceptions of the police and the military, and that the military is seen in most places as more prestigious. And so there's a sense of, or that there's like more public support for the military. And so some of the sort of international trends in militarized policing have been for politicians to be able to try and draw upon the popularity of the military to signal that they're taking crime, or they're taking an insurgency, they're taking whatever sort of domestic challenges they're having, they're taking it very seriously, and that it's possibly going to be more popular to use either the military itself or a very militarized police force rather than local police or other federal police that might be seen as corrupt or inefficient. And so there's some sort of political incentives that can be on that side as well.
Thanks so much, Erica. I was wondering, I guess I had a couple questions, Christian, for you. One is that I think of all of us, you've got the longest history in studying this, and I'm wondering if you could put in perspective for us the extent to which what we're seeing right now is new versus the broader public is becoming more aware of it, and it's what has been going on for a very long time. And then my second question, if you don't mind following up, is that you started to talk about this idea of maybe we don't need these institutions, or we need to, I think that you're referring to some of the movements to defund the police. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that, the arguments for that, and I think a lot of the public is unclear about what that means and why, how that would work.
I'll try to interpret your question in that you just didn't call me old, and I'm supposed to roll with that. But as we're all friends here, I'll proceed. To the extent to which what are we seeing that's new? I think. What's interesting is, like, you could basically go into any city in America, decent size, and look through old records of civil society institutions or churches in Black and Latino communities and see some reference to police abuse. So, and this is like early 1900s. I mean, like, so the NAACP starts in 1907, 1908, 1909. You have some records that are back there and indicating that there's a problem of police violence directed towards Black folk. And so it's just that not many people outside of the Black community were paying attention to this or hearing it. And so I think there's an element now that the ubiquitous nature of cell phones and so forth within the Black community are facilitating a certain degree of monitoring and distribution and so forth that we weren't exactly seeing before. But there's other trace evidence in other places that reveals a similar degree of prevalence that I think would suggest that it's not necessarily new. And then it's kind of interesting, right? We lose some sense of history. I'm not sure if the repression and protest policing and policing we see post 9/11 is worse than the early 1900s. I think we have an eradication of certain ideological orientations from the United States. Anarchists, communists, socialists, gone. Go try to find some. It's like Bob Avakian is around, that's basically it. And so we have a whole ideological spectrum, and the institutions and people that were associated with it gone. And so as we think of how bad things got post 9/11, then it's kind of an issue of kind of like, well, okay, well, what are we missing in terms of the comparative nature? And the 60s and 70s in the United States, or the anti-labor activities taken by US corporations and the government, far exceeded that which we saw in Europe, for example, as one comparison, and to a certain degree also in Central Latin America. So I think that's there. The need for the institution comment that I made, so you notice I was kind of, not deflecting, I was recontextualizing the defund or abolish discussion with Hobbes. I mean, there's an element we have to our discussion as political scientists or those in public policy or related fields where it's like, we can't imagine a world without these institutions. And I'm like, says who? We didn't start with them. We created them to address certain problems. They developed momentum, and we're relying upon them for information about their own existence, which is just so weird. How secure are we? We rely upon the same institutions to tell us how secure we are. Well, are we surprised that there's always a problem and that we're so fearful? I mean, like, I don't think so. So I think I don't like the defund or abolish labels. It should have been, do we need to have a reprioritization of where we spend our public funds? That would have been a healthier conversation. So then we start talking about it, and you see it, right? It's becoming interesting where you have, we're thinking about what are police tasked to do? What do they actually do? What do they spend time on? And now there's an actual discussion about, okay, maybe they shouldn't be called out to address certain individuals with kind of like medical or mental problems. Maybe some other institutions should be called for that. That's a real conversation, and I'm glad that happened, but we should contextualize that. What happened to these other institutions? Why did we defund and abolish them? And how do we end up with this over-reliance upon this one institution to do all these other things? Why did we gut civil society effectively? And so I don't see that conversation, but we should have that one. And the broader one, back to Hobbes, which is kind of like, you know, if the state's not doing what it's supposed to do, they should go. That's just basic Hobbes. It's just like, okay, it's like the state's supposed to do certain things, and one of those is counter behavior challenges. Okay, fine. But if the state overproduces violence, they also should go, and we should mobilize around that. And so we're in this interesting space where we're actually starting to question and think about what the state is doing and how legitimate is it, and how that power is being used against different populations. And so you were talking about, like, you know, where's the hope or happiness in many respects. One, we should stop hoping for a happy ending and a hopefulness all the time. That's just some American pathology. Let's just go with facts and reality. But the reality is, I'm loving being in this moment because spending all this time in this country, we've not had this conversation. We've not had this thorough vetting of institutions and behavior and talking about data and trying to figure out exactly who's doing what to whom. So I think this is a fantastic moment because we're finally actually, oh, wow, people are dying. Thank you for acknowledging it. Thank you for getting to that point. And so now we're in a space. I'm not sure how long that space is going to last, but now we're in that space. And so in that place, we can now talk about what role should these institutions play? What should we actually be spending our money on? And that discussion of reprioritization, I find to be incredibly invigorating.
Great, thanks so much. Javier, did I see your hand or was that? No, okay, all right. So we can actually open it up. Kyle, do we have some questions that?
We do. We have some excellent questions. I'm actually going to combine two and see what the panelists can do with it. So we have one of the attendees says that Christian's earlier point is really important, that policing in the US developed primarily in response to slavery, urbanization, immigration, and labor organization. So it has always been militarized in the cultural sense, and the only people whose safety it was interested in was the white owner or the managerial classes. So we're going to take that as a premise, and then we're going to layer on a question that maybe is asking for a little bit of hope, which is that the attendee is reminded of a quote that every system is designed perfectly to function the way that it does. So is our policing system broken, or was it designed this way? So I guess the question for you all is to reflect on sort of the origins of policing, at least in the US, but we can even think more broadly. And with those origins in mind, how do we fix it if we accept that premise and it is so deep in those prior times?
Yeah, Christian.
Just jumping in.
Yep, go for it.
What's interesting is implied within the question, there's a certain degree of coherence to violence workers, security force institutions that I'm not sure exists. I mean, how many do we have? 14, 18,000? We debate about that, right? How many filled out the LAMAS or LAMAS, depending upon how you want to pronounce it, survey to identify exactly what exists within police departments? And so there's this element of, there might have been some, you know, logic behind having slave raids and other types of constabularies in certain locations, but to go from those kind of isolated small things to, okay, now we have all these cities and all these poor people who just came up north with no skills, who presumably are kind of upset. Oh, now we have all these immigrants coming over. They also aren't necessarily, they don't have a house and we need to figure out what to do. Now we have the social order issue. And then so let's create some institutions to address that. it seems like we're dealing with several hundred years worth of extemporaneous kind of like, just like, let's come up with some like solution to this problem. And now all these things concatenate to give us the current situation. And we're looking for a single logic, which might be problematic. There's probably multiple logics running in multiple locations. And then, I mean, I then think of, what's the Michael Moore movie about his hometown. Flint.
Only for Columbine?
Yes. It's like the security apparatus in that city must have changed dramatically across the deindustrialization that took place in that spot. You imagine that policing looked very different when the majority of the population was working for the relevant companies. And then as those companies left, then their role shifted. But it was kind of an interesting conversation in the film to kind of see that they were the only people that had secure employment, but they felt so horrible about what it is that they were being tasked to do. And so you imagine as we had massive deindustrialization in the United States, then that role ends up shifting. And we never actually had an open conversation. So what should the police do now? Other than kind of going, okay, well, we see drugs as being a problem. Well, why were drugs a problem? Well, because of the deindustrialization. So we kind of keep improvising responses, and it's not quite clear that there's the coherence there. So I feel like it's the kind of 90s with regards to the Civil War literature where we're looking for a single explanation for all Civil War, when actually we might have different things driving different security force agents in different parts of the country, which lend itself to a very different kind of research design and like answer to our problem, right?
Abby.
Sure. So I agree with Christian is that I think that there's not any kind of monocausal element here. And I think that there is an absolute need to look at things from a pluralistic approach. The part of the question that I want to address is, were police designed this way? And I would argue that historically, I don't think so. I think there's an attempt, at least in theory, to try to separate police from the military. You look at a variety of different legal mandates that were intended to do that. One that's frequently pointed to, the Posse Comitatus Act, which is enacted in the Reconstruction period in US history, attempting to prohibit the use of the military as a civilian police force. But what we start to see based on a variety of different incentives is that tools like that, or things that were put in place and intended to keep those different groups separated, those institutions change and evolve over time. Those constraints are eroded. So you see, like Posse Comitatus, for example, it's said, oh, well, it doesn't apply to those Western territories because they're not technically states. And then you fast forward this to the 1970s, and there are a variety of different court cases that basically just take the teeth out of it, if it had any to begin with. And you start to see through a variety of different mechanisms, a bunch of different chinks kind of in the armor that's supposed to be protecting these two different groups. I think maybe what's interesting to think about is maybe why does this, in addition to, because I think what people brought up earlier, the just availability of knowledge and data about what's going on with police in different communities is more available than it was now. But I do think that there is something to be said for, why is it that you don't see or you don't hear people talking about widespread police militarization when you do have police doing things like putting down workers' revolts in West Virginia? Why do you not see it then, but why do you see it now? And I think there are a variety of different things that we could point to. Some of the things that we've already brought up, things like weapons flows, and then also things like military tactics being incorporated into policing.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to move on to a question from a audience attendee who identifies coming from Nigeria. So he says, as a result of my country's long history of military dictatorship, we have witnessed active military involvement in virtually everything, even in things like traffic control, and that the heavy military involvement has continued even after democratization of Nigeria. And so the question, and Risa, I'm actually going to start with you. But I'm also then curious what the other panelists have to think is, to what extent do we think that the military should be involved in democratic governance?
My personal opinion is not at all. So pretty straightforward. You know, I think what you're seeing there, especially in cases like Nigeria, and it's not one I know well, but in other places around the world where militaries are involved in all these sort of civic functions beyond just policing, I mean, they're doing everything, is sort of the absence of state capacity and this sort of pathology of some path dependence, that, you know, you have weak institutions and then militaries take roles, and that sort of has a trajectory unto itself. I think, to bring it back a little bit to the US context too, I think we're seeing that here. I think that one thing that I would sort of add to the discussion that we've had so far is sort of a societal, cultural fascination and affinity and belief in the military as being able to solve all problems. This used to be called militarism, this concept, but I think that, you know, that is a real dynamic. And we're seeing, like, you can go out and you can look at articles about COVID-19 and, you know, it's a war on COVID and let's have the military solve it. And let's, you know, I just saw an article, the military's role in creating a vaccine. I mean, it's, you know, there may be a role there, but it's supplanting and taking over all of the other parts of civil society, or too much of civil society. And I think in a way, you know, I don't know culturally in Nigeria how sort of that affinity for military and all things military, for the military and everything associated with it would play a role, but certainly that's a factor here. That is, there's a reason the police want to emulate the military. It's not just about fancy equipment, it's about the popularity and social esteem and the way that American society embraces the military.
Javier.
Yeah, just keeping this in comparative perspective, in many other locations outside of the US where the state is not so strong, sometimes government authorities, they don't have other options because the police is so poor, so under-resourced, under-trained. They're not a match to the security challenges that they have in place. So what many of these government authorities do is they call the only thing that they have at their disposal, which is the military. Unfortunately, in order to fill that gap, instead of funding and developing police apparatus that is more focused on serving the population, they bring soldiers who have military training, and they put them like in the streets controlling traffic, but they're trained to kill, to be aggressive, to see enemies instead of citizens. And that opens oftentimes the door to these harsh military police, civil interactions that open the door for human rights violations and the lack of accountability that comes with that. I think that is a different case than what we see in the US, where we do have a strong state in many levels, and those states probably at the subnational level are increasing their capacities towards a more militaristic approach to deal with the population. That still opens the door to more human rights violations and tensions within the population, and undermining public opinion about government agencies and security forces, both police and the military, which is very concerning for democratic governance in the US.
Christian, and then Erica after Christian.
Yeah, I was just going to say, occasionally you get in these events, and then we kind of go, well, you know, comparatively, but I'm kind of like, the US lies behind so many other militaries around the globe that we shouldn't just make it seem like there's no connection between what is happening in the US military and many of these other militaries, as we're the ones who trained them, put them in power, facilitated their access, stopped criticizing them, and a bunch of other things that just kind of enable these repressive activities to take place. And related to that, it's kind of, I mean, we have police out in the street to our Nigerian visitor. We have militaries out in the street, but then you also have, I always thought it was Eisenhower's comment about the military-industrial congressional complex was important with regards to, sometimes you just secure the budget, and that access to cash and resources precludes your necessity for having to go out in the street because you're good, because you're incredibly well paid. So we need to also remember that there's different manifestations of military influence and control that we should pay attention to, some that are more visible than others.
Yeah, these are great points so far. I was just going to say, you know, back to the sort of original question of the military and involvement in democratic governance, that I agreed with Risa, that ideally the role is none. But that reminded me that one thing I think we haven't mentioned yet is, in terms of other factors driving militarized policing, is that in some states, building up militarized and paramilitary police is a deliberate strategy to try and keep the military out of politics. And so, for example, this is a strategy undertaken by post-independence leaders in India who are very, very concerned, sort of watching what was happening in Pakistan, to keep the military out of politics. And so you see a massive expansion of internal security forces in India so that the military itself doesn't get drawn into a sort of domestic political role. And so I think that there's, you know, Risa brought up earlier this issue that there's clear differences between military and police forces, and they all have sort of different interests, all the different security forces, and they can have these sort of competing interests, or they can be complementary in other periods. But that one sort of central driver of militarized policing outside of the United States really has been, in some cases, concern about preventing military intervention. And so they're fostering sort of deliberate competition between these forces to try and keep the military from intervening through a sort of direct military coup or leading to a military dictatorship. That's not what drove the, you know, proliferation of police forces in the United States necessarily. This was that we have all sorts of local and state level and federal forces that were created for different reasons. As Christian said, there's not necessarily like a master plan here of what's happening, but the military police really do end up playing that role in a lot of other countries.
And I have one more question related to the military before we're going to go back to some questions related to police per se. So the question is, one of our attendees is curious about thoughts about divisions in the military between, say, the officers and the enlisted in terms of their culture of engagement. Could this play a role if we end up with a sort of a civ mil crisis of having illegal orders or unlawful orders coming from the White House?
Yes, it could be a problem. I mean, it's sort of a military's worst nightmare is that you have these sort of internal divisions and breakdown in cohesion. I will bring in a little current politics for the moment and say, you know, recently we heard Donald Trump talking about, you know, making disparaging remarks about the senior military leadership and then saying the troops love him. Now, whether that's empirically true or not, I don't know, but I can tell you that that kind of comment has potentially really big ramifications for the military if you do start to see those kinds of divisions and a breakdown in discipline. And that concern about that will drive how the US military responds if Donald Trump does decide to deploy them to the streets, because they want to preserve their own internal cohesion. It's a highly valued thing in a corporate or institutionalized military like the US military. So there's a lot going on with those dynamics, intra-military dynamics, and sort of analytically, they're not very well understood, although there's some new work on that. But it is really important question with ramifications on different levels.
I see Christian.
Sorry. Actually, my comment question is for Risa, basically. I'm just kind of like, what I find interesting about these conversations about kind of like Trump's trying to divide and rule within the military conversation is it all seems to be related to Army. I'm just kind of like, what about the Marines? I'm like, internationally, we're just kind of like, well, what's the Air Force going to do? Because they just trump everything else, right? I'm like, okay, and we have some water, so okay, the Navy might matter, but I'm just kind of like, as you start to break, I imagine someone is trying to figure this out. Okay, so if I've never heard of conversations like this as prevalent, like if the president accepts the election, if we have massive civil unrest, it's just like amazing to see the conversation in and of itself happen. But what I find intriguing is on the day-to-day basis, you have the military hierarchy and and individuals that Trump is playing to largely being deferent to this leadership on a day-to-day basis. So he's tried to kind of interfere with it, interfering with the courts, the military courts and so forth. But I'm just kind of sitting there going, I'm like, I haven't anyone talk about like, okay, so what's Special Forces going to do? Okay, what are the Marines going to do? Who's the Air Force going to side with? And I'm just kind of like, once you start making that kind of breakdown, I'm kind of going, okay, I think the scenario where like some grunts from some lower level unit decide to kind of like secede and break off from their little location in South Carolina, they're going to be countered by the Air Force. So, you know, I'm like, so I'm just trying to figure out how military folks or people that are more sensitive to that, how they think of that.
I think that they don't want to think about it, to be honest with you. I think that, you know, this divisions, if there's anything that's going to spark a reaction from the military leadership, is this kind of stuff. I think the other stuff that Trump does, sort of like using them as political props, is they view as a nuisance. But this sort of deep sort of violation of the organizational norms is a real fear. And it's something that, especially the old guys, because they are from Vietnam, remember this sort of internal turbulence and cohesion issues, and that resonates. So I think it's an interesting, you know, if we weren't living it, it would be more interesting, but we are, like, to observe it and kind of see the dynamics playing out. And I don't imagine those comments went out really well. I'll just add one other thing. My comparative work makes me think that if I were somebody who was an aspiring dictator, what I would do is go into the military leadership and try to find the people that were going to be my sort of allies within it. And some of these activities, to the extent we want to sort of give Donald Trump that kind of foresight, you know, impute that some of this may be sort of trying to figure out who these people are. And again, it wouldn't surprise me. It's sort of part of the playbook. So I don't know, but it's a fascinating and highly disturbing time on many levels as we've gotten at.
Well, then maybe there'll be some lessons that we can get from outside of the US. So I'm going to turn to a panelist or a attendee's question with the interest in Latin America and curious about how in Latin America, it seems like there's a problem where demilitarizing the police translates to policing it. That is, policing the police. I'm taking that. So, and Javier, we'll turn to you, and we're also curious about the other panelists. How can we break a cycle of that type of demilitarization and then maybe too heavily policing the police in places like Colombia and Mexico?
Well, unfortunately, I think there are bigger forces that prevent these demilitarizations, quite the opposite. Plan Colombia in Colombia and the Mexico, the Merida Initiative is political will, international pressure, training, financial resources, helicopters, guns, military presence in these countries. So there are many things that probably would prevent us from demilitarizing the police. But I think there are some little examples, or at least emerging evidence that there are alternatives, which is community-oriented policing, right? Instead of arming the police to the teeth and sending them out to patrol with armored vehicles in urban settings, there are different ways of approaching this, sometimes at the very small community level. These are government agencies just trying very shyly to incorporate these approaches, and some of the evidence still is elusive. We don't have that good indications of these things working, but at least a few things that we know from community-oriented policing is that increases trust in community. By incorporating the police with local governance, you bring the authorities to fix the lights, like garbage on the streets, like many of the social or societal criminological factors that increase crime, you can address them by not engaging the police, but government authorities who are in charge of lighting, roads and construction, and public works, and public health. All these different aspects provide some glimpses of evidence that there are alternatives to policing. Whether we have realistic political will to really shift all that, we rarely see that in Latin America. Probably the more sharpest turn that we've seen is in Bolivia and Uruguay, just decriminalizing some of the drugs there and not enforcing or not using military policing to actually go after drug producers, especially in areas that are very indigenous, where all this is part of their ancestral traditions. But there are alternatives. I'm not really optimistic that we're going to see a very sharp turn. Probably we're going to keep seeing the politicization, sorry, the militarization of police throughout Latin America and many other parts of the developing world.
Great, thanks, Javier. And I think you answered the question that was asked, and the question that I said was policing, but it should have been politicization. I was reading that too fast, and my apologies to Gio for botching that question. So to the other panelists, building on what Javier was saying, are there other issues of politicization of the police and not just demilitarization or militarization of the police? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and move on then to another question. I think Javier knocked it out of the park, so I think that's where we're at. So the speakers have talked a lot about police violence and militarization of the police. And this attendee is asking if there are realistic models out there in other countries that might offer alternatives to the model we have in the US. For example, in France, having firefighters seeming to perform roles that provide aid to people or assisting in medical situations. And can we think about more positive models that are being done abroad that we could actually import to the US? Christian?
So as anyone's kind of heard me say, I'm a big fan of the Scandinavian countries, Norway in particular. What I found interesting about being there for long periods of time and watching and then interacting with people in the Norwegian Peace Academy is there's a general level of training that they're receiving that is not confrontational at all. It's all about kind of communication and interaction with folks. This all built upon the principle that all are equal, all have a job, all have a place to live. I mean, so there's the fundamental nature of policing is altered by this general utilitarian equity. And so we could seriously demilitarize and eliminate the role that police are playing within society if we had one that didn't have these huge gaps across so many different dimensions concurrently. So I think that's there. What I found interesting was, at least when I first started going there about 10, 12 years ago, the police weren't armed. They had access to weapons. In order to gain access to the weapons, they had to receive approval from a central office and describing the situation, and then it would be released electronically. But they weren't just walking around with them. And so this seemed to be, I was curious about that in many respects and was asking folks about it. But this kind of played into the training of de-escalation and communication and interaction, which I thought was fascinating. There's also this viral video that happened where there's some Swedish cops that were in New York interacting with some kind of belligerent person on the train, and you saw how they acted. Now, as a New Yorker, I knew exactly how, as a New Yorker whose uncle and 5 cousins were NYPD, I knew how this would have rolled if they had been present. And it doesn't involve sitting on the ground with this belligerent person, laughing, and kind of like just like engaging with them in a manner that I found to be so humane and humorous and so different from the highly aggressive militarized way that I'm just used to NYPD people interacting with folks. So clearly there's a bunch of different models that could be drawn upon. And I think part of this defunding abolition conversation is kind of pushing people in the direction of, okay, so what kind of civilian state engagements would we like to see, and who's best to have that interaction, rather than just kind of tasking all civil state interactions to, these police authorities. So I think a bunch of models exist, but the models hint at the interrelated nature between police-civilian relationships and civilian societal relationships, civilian corporate relationships, civilian larger state relationships. And so I don't think we can isolate that question.
So I just wanted to jump in and ask what you thought, Christian, but maybe others might have ideas about this. How does the fact that our own population is so armed play into these options, right? The idea of police not being armed, you know, how possible is that when we have a situation where we've got white supremacist militias and you know, folks that are defending their, you know, their use of ranch land, and all these folks that are heavily armed, and you know, does that have to change at the same time that our approach to policing changes?
I was quickly trying to pull up the estimated number of guns per 100 people throughout the globe, because I do recall that, I mean, like the Canada, Iceland, and a couple of Scandinavian countries are actually high up there. So it's like they do have weapons. So there's something else about the culture that has this element. What I found fascinating, and if anyone else reflects on this, please let me know your opinions as well. What I found fascinating about dealing with the COVID situation and then the kind of racial violence discussion is the degree of individualism within the country. And everyone kind of going for self. And you do have some mutual aid societies that are popping up every now and then, but a bunch of people are just kind of like, don't tell me what to do. And don't, so it sounds like everyone sounded like the bad New Yorker stereotype in many respects, with pockets of communities in like little small areas. But that general sense of individualism and this kind of liberty comment that Javier was talking about as well, and not wanting to be held accountable and not viewing things in a communal fashion, and no, we're not going to work through this together. Get off my property before I shoot you. I mean, it's just like that I found to be, that's the thing I think needs to be adjusted. And that seems to have all these other spin-off effects. I mean, like rather than talk to your neighbor about some problem, you'll call the police. I mean, so there's many aspects of civility that I think are just kind of undermined by a general kind of predisposition that Americans have towards civic engagement that also facilitates this excessive policing dynamic.
I think I see Abby.
Yeah, just tying together kind of this question and the last one, is that one of the things that people have proposed in terms of practical reform for police militarization is doing things like rolling back access to weapons, particularly as they pertain to the 1033 program. And often the counter argument that people raise to that is, well, the people who police are encountering are utilizing all of these high caliber, high grade weapons. And therefore, if we don't arm our police, then our police are going to be ill-equipped. I think if you actually look at the data in detail, it's not that police are facing people with grenade launchers and AK-47s on a daily basis. But even if they were, this continued arming of police, it doesn't actually do anything to solve the problem. What you essentially do is just create an arms race, a hypothetical one, between police and then this other group that is supposedly coming after to harm them.
Risa.
I really like the idea of thinking about it as a societal issue rather than thinking about it purely as a compartmentalized kind of coercive sector problem. And the reason I say that is I teach this course on political violence, and I show them, my students, this the documentary on Timothy McVeigh and Oklahoma City. And that, going back a long time, the association of guns and firearms in a very different way than you see in Scandinavian countries, right? It is a cultural signifier, it's a symbolism. And that sort of is also both reflected in why the police want culturally to have those weapons, and also affects their need to have those weapons. And I think if we don't understand that larger cultural dynamic, we're going to not be able to solve deal with the cause, some of the causes, and we're going to be dealing with a lot of symptoms. just a sort of reflection on that.
If I could use that to bridge over to one of the questions that we got from our attendees. So as Abby was talking about these armed groups that may be in an arms race with the police, but what if those armed groups are, in a sense, pro-police militia or pro agents of the state militia? If we defund the police, might that be replaced by an emboldened militias? And then if we can think comparatively, how has the US experience with militia compared with other countries that have also experienced pro-government, pro-police, pro-state militia forces? Christian.
What's interesting is tracking the kind of ideology of some of this, right? I mean, if you think of kind of like what was going on in the 60s, we had like a fundamental kind of like moment of sorts where you had a bunch of militia organizations on the left and the right, and the federal government basically said on the side that was white and right was kind of, sorry, right in a different way, that basically said like, we'll let you continue to exist. In fact, we'll facilitate you in many respects and help guide you away from violence, but we'll still allow you to exist because we still believe fundamentally in what it is you're trying to do, as opposed to the black left. They were fundamentally disarming and attacking and putting them in jail and killing them off in many respects. And so many of these organizations that existed under that kind of rubric end up kind of like morphing into different parts of the neo-fascist movement and Aryan nations and all these other things. And so we end up kind of like facilitating them. And so it's interesting to kind of see how they evolve over time and where they kind of cultivated. And it wasn't as if the United States did not know of the militias like McVeigh's militia and so forth. They were just tolerated and they were allowed to kind of exist in many respects because they were largely anti-government, but not in a violent way. And so it was an interesting degree of tolerance that was facilitated, but following the Oklahoma City bombing, it's just like, you read exactly what the United States government did to this militia group. They were gone. They were just like completely wiped out. So then you're kind of like, all right, so where did this new group come from? How did this new group develop? Who are these people? And like, where were they kind of like getting these associations from? And I think of Verda Taylor's work on the Bay instructors, and it's kind of like, they kind of went underground. They found a different way to organize. They found a different way to continue. And I'm kind of like, well, they weren't infiltrated. They weren't known about. They were allowed to facilitate and grow again. And now they're at this space. But then it's kind of like jurisdictional, right? I'm just like, okay, so if local police can't take you out because you have so much hardware, then isn't that why they have different levels of people that are going to go in and like handle these things? But similar to kind of like where I think Abigail was going, but it's like, how frequent are those kind of shootouts? I mean, like, Waco was incredibly rare and they were completely outgunned. I mean, in terms of like military hardware, I'm like, where has any local police or local agencies been outgunned, so to speak? And so I'm just like, given all the weapons that are available, I don't think that this relative kind of like outpacing has taken place where the US military, it was necessary to step in because there was no other security force agency that was able to take them out, so to speak. So it's kind of this interesting mix of folks we have where it's like, we have all these weapons, there's all these, if you ever go to gun shows, you see all these kind of crazy things that folks have, and you're kind of like, wow, that's actually, why is that being sold? But all these weapons exist, but I'm actually surprised that they're not used more frequently. And if they were used, then you'd see, I think, an escalation, which I'm not seeing, which I think is kind of interesting to kind of think about these different scenarios.
See, Javier.
I think we have several cases in Latin America that show the consequences of eventually unleashing these forces, right? That start small and then they just transform or mutate into something that is, even the state is totally incapable of controlling. And probably the ultimate example of that is Colombia, right? Where you had at some point in the 80s, small rural elites, ranchers who were very wealthy, that were fed up of the insurgents kind of raiding their communities or taking their properties. They decided to arm themselves, right? And they started doing that throughout the country, all the way to eventually start conforming little armies that eventually amalgamated into the unified self-defense forces of Colombia. And that became a very large predatory force that they cooperated with the state. The state provided some training or weapons. Most importantly, they took their hands off So they will engage in really horrible events of violence, massacres, mass displacement, most of that to conquer land for their own ranches, to start growing oil palm, to extract emeralds, to control oil fields. So those aspects, eventually the state might just collaborate with them a little bit, but sometimes when they're armed and there are enough of them, they just go out of control and they assemble very large armies. They conducted violence throughout the entire country for decades. And eventually it was very hard for the state to control. They have to pass an armistice and demobilize them. Some of them became politically elected government officials. And the repercussions are so enduring that now we have President Uribe, or the former President Uribe, being in charge of these linkages with paramilitary forces that conducted so much violence and enabling him to become president at some point. So once you unleash these forces, it's very hard for the state to tame them, to control them. And this is one of the risks that we have in the US. This alliance is probably some right-wing supremacists with some police departments, or at least some police officers, that if you allow them to range free, eventually it's going to be very hard for them to put back into control.
Christian, I see the two finger.
Yeah, Javier's comment is really kind of provocative in many ways. I'm just like, because his language was like, allow them. It's just like the all-powerful state can identify and take out all challengers. I'm like, your conception of the state there, Javier, was, I thought very dramatic. And I'm just kind of like, why are we presuming that they're able to identify all challengers, take them out, and outdo them? We're just giving states way too much credit, I think, in many respects. And so I think we need to roll that back in many ways and kind of think about like, okay, well, maybe we're just giving them way too much credit and we're overthinking what capability might look like in terms of, okay, maybe you can't get into Appalachia and figure out everybody who does or does not like you, which would be analogous to some other countries. But it seems like I think we're just presuming that things are just way too much controlled in the country.
And I actually agree with that. I mean, in many of these areas, the origin of these forces were self-defense forces because the state was not there to protect them, right? What do? They arm themselves. When they find themselves armed and organized, hey, now time to move on for the, in terms of escalation of violence, right? But yeah, I don't assume that the state is omnipresent or omnicapable. It's actually the weakness of the state in some areas of the territory that allows us for these proxy or paramilitary forces to become active.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the attendees for excellent questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. I'm sure we would be happy to engage with you offline. We're generally available. And I'm going to pass it back up to Tricia.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. So much to think about here, and excellent comments from all of you. And I also want to thank all our attendees, and do hope that you will continue to engage with these issues and also to follow the Triangle Institute and some of our upcoming events. I also want to thank Kyle, and also thank Carolyn Pumphrey at the Triangle Institute for all sorts of logistical and technical support. And you know, again, we're sorry that we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I think that we could talk about this for days. And I'm glad that we got this conversation started. So thank you to you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you all. And I'm going to log off, so we won't see each other briefly, but take care.
All right.
Everyone.
Thanks so much, Khaled. Great job.
You too.
All right.
Great job, everyone.
Thank you all. Be in touch. Bye.